Okay, in this video I want to show you three different examples of how to solve a complex quadratic equation. If you're not sure how to solve one to begin with, you might want to watch the other video first, but this one's just three examples of what it might look like. Okay, so in this example, I have x squared plus x minus 6 equal to 0. First thing I always have to check for is that it equals to 0. It indeed does equal to 0. So we're ready to identify a, b, and c. So let's go with A, B, and C. A is always the number out front. In this case, it's missing, so it is going to be the number 1. Next, we want the number in front of X, which again is a missing number. So again, it is the number 1. And lastly, I want the number that's all by itself, including signs on all three of these. The signs here is negative, so C ends up being negative 6. Okay, we're going to use the quadratic formula, which if you forgot is going to be the opposite of B, plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a, and this is the a, b, and c we just came up with from our standard equation. Okay, so using our formula, we're going to have negative 1, because b is 1, plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4, a is also 1, and c is a negative 6, and that's all over 2 times 1. Okay. Next, we're going to start reducing. Out front is just negative 1, so we can rewrite that with a plus or minus symbol. On the bottom, we have 2 times 1, which is just the number 2, and now we start dealing with this square root. So 1 squared is the number 1, and the 4ac is 4 times 1, which is 4, times 6 is 24. And I left some space right here because I have to go back and look at the signs. So I have a negative times another negative. I know this was a minus, but you can treat it as a negative for this purpose. A negative times a negative is a positive, so we're going to change this to a plus. Okay? Next, we're going to finish underneath the square root, so I'm going to rewrite everything else. And under the square root, we got 1 plus 24, which is, of course, the number 25. And we should know that the square root of 25 is simply the number 5, so we don't need to keep writing the square root of 25. We're going to write what we know it equals to, which is just simply 5. Okay, lastly, we're going to solve this by taking the plus the first time and the minus the second time. So using the plus, we're going to get negative 1 plus 5 divided by 2. And negative 1 plus 5 is 4, so that's 4 divided by 2, which is simply the number 2. That's one solution. The other solution is to use the negative, so we got negative 1 minus 5 divided by 2. Negative 1 minus 5 is negative 6, which when you divide it by 2 gives you negative 3. So those are your two solutions, 2 and negative 3. Now you could have factored this one and gotten 2 and negative 3 that way as well, but you can always use the quadratic formula. So let's look at two cases where factoring does not work. In this case, we have y equals 2x squared plus 2x plus 5. The first thing is we need it equal to 0. It's not currently equal to 0, but that's easy to solve. We're simply going to make y 0, so we're going to just set it equal to 0 because we picked y to be 0. Now we can solve it. We got a, b, and c. So a is 2, this number right up front here. B is also going to be 2, which is this number here, including its sign. And C ends up being 5, because the 5 is this time positive. So we got A, B, and C. Using the quadratic formula again, we got the opposite of B, which is 2, plus or minus the square root of B squared minus 4 times A times C, all over 2 times A. Okay? Just like before, we're going to start simplifying it. Out front, I have a negative 2 with a plus or minus. That's the easy part. The bottom, I got 2 times 2, which is 4. And now I start dealing with the square root symbol. 2 times 2 is 4, because that's what 2 squared means. Over here, I got 4 times 2, which is 8. And 8 times 5 is going to be 40. So, yeah, 4 times 2 is 8. And 8 times 5 is 40. Okay, and there's one minus, so we're going to put a minus symbol there. And now we finish cleaning up underneath the square root symbol, and we got 4 minus 40, which is negative 36. And what we should have already learned is anytime you see a negative under the square root symbol, we're going to take it outside as simply an I, because by definition, the square root of negative 1 is equal to I. And this is an italics I. Okay, so by taking it out, we get negative 2 plus or minus the square root of 36. The I is outside the square root symbol, divided by 4. And now I can keep going. You know the square root of 36, which is 6. So this is the same as negative 2 plus or minus 6i over 4. Because we replaced the square root of 36 with 6. The I was already outside, so it stays outside. Now, lastly, we're going to separate this into two separate fractions. The 4 goes to both the -2 and the 6i. I'm going to write it over here for more space. So we got -2 over 4. So that was right here, -2 over 4, plus or minus. And then we're going to do the same thing over here. So we have 6i over 4. So 6i over 4. And the last step is to reduce our fractions. -2 over 4 is the same as 1/2, plus or minus. And 6 over 4 reduces to 3/2, and we put the I outside. So this is -1/2 plus or minus 3/2 I. This is the best answer. As long as you get this far, you'd be a level 3. And as long as you get this far, you're going to be a level 2. Okay? So make sure that you can at least get this far. You should be in good shape. But if you want to be a level 4, go ahead and take it all the way to the end and separate out your fractions into, this is called a real part, and this would be called an imaginary part. So you should always be able to separate these fractions. You can leave them as 1 with the plus and minus, or you could write it twice. If you wrote it twice, it'd be 1/2 plus 3/2 I, and the other answer is -1/2 minus 3/2 I. All right, let's look at our last example. In this example, we have x squared plus 3x minus 5 equals x. Our first problem is does not equal 0, and we don't have an easy y equals that we can change to 0. So the first thing we have to do is solve it for 0. We're going to do that by looking at the easiest thing to move, which in this case is this little x all by itself over here. And we want to move it by simply subtracting it, because when we do x take away x, we get 0. And if I do it on one side, we have to do it on the other side of the equal sign. So don't forget like terms. X is not like x squared. X is not like the simple number 5, but it is like 3x, because an x can add with another x. So below the 3x, we're going to put that minus x there. Okay, and if there's not one, you would just write it. So the x minus x goes away, and I'm left with x squared. 3x minus x is 2x, minus 5. And on the right side, because nothing was left, we now have that equals 0 we want. So we're going to go with a, b, and c. A is 1, because it's the number out front of x squared. B ends up being -2. It's the number, I'm not sure why I have a -2 there. It should be a positive 2. 3x minus x is positive 2x. Okay, so that should be a positive 2x. And then -5 is c. All right, so now that we have a, b, and c, we're going to use the quadratic formula. So we have the opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c all over 2 times a. And start simplifying. Out front we have a -2 with a plus or minus symbol. On the bottom we end up with 2 times 1, which is 2. And in the square root we got 2 squared is 4. And then let's deal with the rest of this. 4 times 1 is 4 times 5 is 20. And I got a negative times a negative is a positive. Okay, so cleaning that up, we end up with -2 plus or minus the square root of 24 over 2. Okay, because 4 plus 20 is 24. Now remember about square roots. We're going to look for things that multiply that have perfect squares in them. 4 times 6 happens to equal 24, so we're going to rewrite square root of 24 as square root of 4 times 6. So moving it on down here, we're going to rewrite that as the square root of 4 times 6, because 4 times 6 is 24. And of course the square root of 4 is simply 2. So the square root of 4 part ends up becoming a 2. And the square root of 6 just stays the square root of 6. So we got -2 plus or minus 2 times the square root of 6 over 6. Separating this into two fractions, you get -2 over 2 plus or minus 2 over 2 times the square root of 6. 2 over 2 is 1, as it is here, so it's -1 plus or minus the square root of 6. And that's the best answer. So just like before, this is the level 4 down here. If you can get to this stage, you're a level 3. And if you get to this stage, you're a level 2 and you're in good shape. If you have any questions, please make sure you ask.